Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Al-Maghrabi. I'm an assistant lecturer at the Cairo University, the Faculty of Mass Communication, and today I'm going to present to you via virtual presentation a title called Conflict in Egypt as Depicted in Asian Cartoons. This is a research paper I have conducted in the past several days that I'm going to present to you in this conference. Between 2011 and 2014, Egypt witnessed dramatic changes in the political arena. After the 30-year rule of Mubarak, the 25th of January revolution ousted Mubarak, declaring the rule of General Tantawi and the SCAF. In the 30th of June, the people elected Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was a year after ousted also by General Sisi, who was then elected as President of Egypt in 2014. Media all around the world followed closely all changes in Egypt and every conflict between different political actors. Researchers in the field of media studies focused heavily US and European coverage of these conflicts. Few studies focused on Asian media. Most studies were concerned with coverage of text, content, frames, and discourse of the conflict. Cartoons were absent to a great extent. What are the goals of this study? This study aims at answering several research questions. What are the topics covered in the Asian cartoons about the conflict that Egypt witnessed? What are the symbols used to present the actors in the analyzed cartoons? The humor techniques that were applied in the analyzed cartoons, and to what extent visual analogy was applied in these cartoons. The methodology of the study. This study is a qualitative content analysis. It is conducted on 28 cartoons from 5 Asian countries and 7 cartoonists. It was conducted from between 2011 to 2014, and the data was collected from the online cartoons directory and archive that is called www.politicalcartoons.com. The sample of the study, it's divided like the following table shows us. The countries are Russia, Israel, India, Iran, China. 2 cartoonists from Russia, 2 cartoonists from Israel, Parish from India, Nick Kosar from Iran, and Lu Joy from China. The most of them was Sergei Tonin from Russia, followed by Parish from India. What are the findings of this study? Well, if we want to analyze the most important topics that were covered in the cartoons, we will find that in January and February 2011, the coverage was focused heavily on the Egyptian revolution of the 25th of January. If we look further, we also find that the cartoonists were interested in covering what happened in Egypt between May and June 2012, which were the elections that Egypt witnessed to select or to elect Morsi. Then afterwards, cartoonists also were interested in covering what happened in Egypt in August and September of the same year, which was the rule of Morsi itself, and how he and the Muslim Brotherhood tried to overcome or just to manage the Egyptian arena. Cartoonists were also interested in covering what happened in Egypt in July and August 2013, which was the oust of Morsi and the 30th of June revolution. So here we can conclude that there are 3 major topics or conflicts that were covered in the 3 analyzed years. In 2011, the conflict between Mubarak and the people was covered heavily. In 2012, the conflict between Morsi and the people, and in 2013, the conflict between Morsi and the military. We can look into details what the topics that the cartoonist was interested in drawing about was mainly in 2011, the last speech that Mubarak held to the people, how he and his regime suppressed protesters, then his oust, then the success of the 25th of January revolution. Some other cartoonists were also interested in covering the relations between the US and Egypt. In 2012, the conflict between Morsi and the people was covered by the cartoonists, like for example the elections of Egypt, like for example Morsi's rule of Egypt, and the conflict as I mentioned. In 2013, the conflict between Morsi and the military, especially his oust, and the massacre of Rab'a that was conducted by the military towards the Muslim Brotherhood supporters, and then also the rule of military-led government afterwards. If we look closely to the symbols that were used to present the actors in analyzed cartoons, we can see following. The people came at first place, especially the Egyptians. Cartoonists, for example, draw a cartoon like this to clarify that Egypt is like a temple. The Egyptians are like little pharaohs who are happy with their elections, as for example by presented in Alexander Zudin's cartoon. Here, for example, people were presented as tortured puppets by the police officers during the 25th of January revolution. Morsi, the former president of the Muslim Brotherhood, was presented here, for example, as a pharaoh by Sergei Tonin, here also by, like an athlete who is trying to weightlift such a heavy weight between the peace treaty between Israel and the support of Gaza. This is a cartoon drawn by Parish, the Indian cartoonist. If we look at Mubarak, the symbols that were used, the most prominent one is, for example, this one. Very obvious by Shlomo Cohen, the Israeli cartoonist, that he is the head of the Sphinx, but he at the same time is the police officer. Yeah. Like threatening and oppressing all the protesters at that time in 2011. If we look at Egypt, what are the symbols used to clarify what Egypt is in the eyes of the cartoonists around the world, and especially in the Asian cartoons? We see that Egypt here, for example, is depicted as pyramids with minarets. Yes, like the Islamization of Egypt by Sergei Tonin, how the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to change the pyramid from Egyptian into Islamic. Another cartoon shows how Egypt's economic circumstances are declining by symbolizing that Egypt is a number of sphinx who are maybe asking the Arabs and the Americans for money, and while the American one and the Arab one, they are looking at them at each other to think whether to give Egyptians money or not. General Tantawi, the leader of the SCAF, was presented, for example, here sitting with Morsi and the Islamist on the same table, trying to share power and trying to divide the cake of power of Egypt together with Morsi and the Islamist. While you see here also that Morsi is having a really big knife and trying to cut the cake and taking this cake that presents Egypt from the hands of General Tantawi and the military to give it to the Islamists in their plate. So the third research question is, how were humor techniques applied in the analyzed cartoons? We we could divide humor techniques into visual humor and verbal humor. In this slide, we are talking about the visual humor. The visual humor could be divided into visual distortion, into opposition and analogy, and this is actually what researchers have agreed on the definition of visual humor. We see, for example, very obvious a visual distortion in which Egypt is presented as a piece of bread or a hamburger that is squeezing al-Qaddafi, the leader of Libya, and Tunisia is squeezing him too to become a burger, symbolizing how the Egyptian revolution and the Tunisian revolution will affect Libya and the circumstances in Libya and Qaddafi. A very catchy cartoon drawn by the Russian Elkhin. Opposition is also very clear to show a sort of humor in which, for example, Sergei Tunin in 2011 shows us here in this cartoon how Egyptians were opposing each other's, how people were shouting no to Mubarak and while others are supporting him, and how both are standing in the both sides of the pyramids. Analogy is also here very clear in the Parish cartoon, in which you see that this card presents Egypt's foreign policy, that is, instead of heading to US, to the Uncle Sam, it's heading to China, while the Uncle Sam is standing there and wondering why Egypt is not coming to the US, but it's changing its foreign policy into China. This was in 2012 when we were governed by the Muslim Brotherhood leader Morsi, who tried to, like, let's say, change our foreign policy with the US into the East. About the verbal humor here, it's very clear, in a very clear cartoon by Dry Bones, the Israeli cartoonists, which says the presidential election in Egypt will offer the voter a choice between the two forces that the Egyptian Spring Revolutionaries opposed. One candidate is from the Muslim Brotherhood and the other is from the army. So this is very funny because he says that the presidential election in Egypt will actually offer the choice between things that we didn't want. So here the verbal humor is very clear, drawn by the Israeli Dry Bones. Again, here a verbal humor by also the Shlomo Cohen from Israel, who says, shove it back to place maybe they won't notice. And this is Obama, clearly, and this is Mubarak. Like, for example, he takes a stone out of the temple of the Middle East, and then his assistant would tell him, like, let's put it back before they won't notice that we changed the relation between Egypt and the US. Let's build up again our relations with Egypt. We see as an answer of the visual analogy applied in the analyzed cartoons the following. We could analyze the visual analogy into the daily life, how daily life was presented in the cartoons. For example, here dominoes. Egypt is one of the dominoes, like Syria, Libya, Egypt, Iraq, and Afghanistan, while here the Statue of Liberty is just hitting them and they're all falling the one after each other. We can also note the popular culture. Here, for example, again, this cartoon of Sergei Tunin, how Egyptians are dressed, how they are on a camel, how they are walking in the desert, and this is like the popular culture of the Egyptians, their dress code, the camel, the colors, the desert, and all of this culture that Egyptians live in, or that the cartoonists always want to present on Egypt. Historical references assure, for example, here the pyramids, the desert again, all the pharaonic symbols, all the historical symbols. These are the most important visual analogies that the cartoonists used. So what can we conclude? We conclude from the study the following. That there are three main topics covered by the Asian cartoonists, which are the conflict between Mubarak and the people, the conflict between Morsi and the people, and the conflict between Morsi and the military. We also note that the people, Morsi and Egypt, were the main actors covered by the Asian cartoonists, and the cartoonists applied several symbols in their drawings to symbolize these actors. That visual and verbal humor were applied heavily by cartoonists, that the historical references are the main visual analogy in analyzed cartoons. What are the future directions of this paper? Research could be extended on African cartoons for more comparison. It could also be conducted on Asian countries and cartoonists. It could also be applied with different tools of analysis such as critical discourse analysis, for example, the CDA and the framing analysis. Thank you so much. This is my email for further contact. Thank you.